Help capture the history of our markets by contributing to the John Lothian News GoFundMe campaign to support the Markets Wiki Education history-focused video series and more.
I was teaching at Berkeley. I taught there from 66 to 72. And during that time, I was trading commodities. And because I had traded some equities, and a friend of mine had suggested that I ought to consider trading beans and the like. And so I did my academic research and ultimately taught a course, which was the first time a futures course was taught within a business school. It had been the subject of Ag Econ, but it was never written up as a formal piece of work within the business community. Going back and forth in trading, the people at the Bank of America and the Commodity Club of San Francisco said to me, we want to start an exchange, but we want it to be all electronic because there's no local traders here in San Francisco. Do you think you could do this? So I got a grant from the Bank of America and took off a quarter to do a feasibility study on a new type of exchange and a new means of trading on that exchange. The exchange called for an all-electronic for-profit exchange. That was pretty radical, as you might imagine, in at the beginning of 1970. But at the end of 69, a couple of key events occurred for me personally, but more importantly, for, I think, what would eventually be the birth of financial futures. In 69, there was a credit crunch in California in the mortgage market. I shared an office with a guy who did real estate finance, and we were discussing it, and I said to him, I think we could create a commodity out of interest rates. And so I began to work, and I got a portfolio from a savings and loan of 18,000 loans and tried to homogenize it based on loan-to-value ratios, borrower's income, neighborhood, marital status, etc. It turned out it was impossible to do statistically. It ended up as a journal article at the University of Chicago on it. But for me but it piqued my interest, and I kept the interest. And afterward, Ginnie Mae was born in 1970, and I said, this gets around all of the problems. It's a homogeneous security, and you don't have to worry about grading a pool of mortgages. This could lend itself to a futures market. Meanwhile, I'm going back and forth to Chicago to try to figure out the algorithms in the pit. Okay, is it an ascending? Is it a bid-driven system? Is it an offer? How do you close the bid offer? Do you raise the bids? Do you lower the offers? And I'm back and forth to Chicago, and I'm getting to really be fascinated by the industry. The electronic bit dies because it was ahead of its time, and they just couldn't see their way to establishing an all-electronic exchange. But my interest persists, so I go back and forth. I start the course. Then I get Warren Liebeck to come out And he gives a lecture, and we're finishing the talk, and he says to me, would you ever consider leaving the academic world? I said, no, I'm pretty happy, but if the job was right, then maybe I would do it. Now it's 1971. I had crystallized the idea for a mortgage-backed futures on Ginnie Mae's. I get a call from a search firm and the Board of Trade has a new professional management. It's Henry Hall Wilson, who was JFK's advisor. And he wants to professionalize the management of the exchange. So they say to me, would you come in? Would you be interested in becoming the vice president and chief economist for the exchange? It was a big deal, the largest commodity exchange in the world at the time. It dominated the profile. It really piqued my interest. I flew to Chicago. At this time, I had met some friends and had a better feel for the market. I had designed a new contract. It was vegetable palm oil. I studied the structure of exchanges. I pretty much knew a lot, but I was a kid. I was 30 years old. I said to him, Henry, I've got two projects I'd like to work on. One is a financial future. Interest rates. I know it's way out of line and it doesn't fit. It's not legally possible under the CEA, but maybe things will change. And the second is, I think there needs to be a risk transfer system for catastrophic risk. And I think that's really exciting. Hurricanes, things of that nature. I had written an article in the British Journal of Finance about the need for risk transfer for catastrophic risk. We signed a deal. I started, working part-time in the spring of 72. So I spent that first year kind of repairing some of the ag contracts, getting to know the ropes, working on Ginnie Mae research and a number of things like that. Then it's 1973 and hell is about to break loose. Bad spring, late planting, anchovies stop running off the coast of Peru, the Russian crop fails, the Chinese crop fails, early frost. By this time, in addition to the explosion in energy and food prices, interest rates went to 10%, which was totally unheard of. Inflation was rearing, and it looked like we'd get a new regulator. So I sat down with Henry, and he said to me and lots of others, of course, what do you think? And I said, I think you should get behind the CFTC. It's coming, and if we do it right, it'll be good for the industry as long as it's intelligently regulated, and have transparent markets would be beneficial. And I said to him, it also gives us a time to create a market where we define the commodity as anything tangible or intangible, and that would enable financial futures. Henry said, well, you can work with Phil, and I had known Herman Talmadge, the Senate of the Ag Committee. Anyway, one thing led to the other. And I, because of a relationship I had with a guy by the name of Mike McLeod, who was head of staff for Talmadge, the CFTC was given exclusive jurisdiction, which meant even if it was a security, it would be governed by the CFTC. The act was passed. We submitted the feasibility study. And 6 years later, October 20th, 1975, we launched the Ginnie Mae futures. The Friday before, The SEC threatened an injunction saying it was a future on a security and therefore SEC. That was all resolved because the legislation was unambiguous. And that Monday, we launched Ginnie Mae Futures, which was, funny enough, the first commodity registered and approved for trading under the Commodity Futures Trading Commission was not a commodity. In the irony of all. Traditionally, as you might expect, the First National Bank of Chicago was like the grain elevator. You know, they held the Ginnie Maes and they issued the depository receipts. And the first movers, of course, were smaller entities. First movers are never the big institutions. You know, they're fast followers, but not fast movers. So it was small Ginnie Mae dealers, mortgage bankers, some S&Ls, and it had such widespread. My first customer was Freddie Mac. And in the design of the contract, Freddie Mac had wanted a futures market because they got scared that they were holding too much loans and they were not hedged. And the agency was never designed to be the final investor. They were supposed to create liquidity in the secondary market. There were no financial firms that were part of the Board of Trade. There was one bank, Continental Bank, but that's because it financed the exchange and had a long-time relationship. Aside from that, none of the investment banks, none of the commercial banks were involved at all. And there were no FCMs, except big, what they called in those days, wirehouses, Beige, and that was a commodity, F. Hutton, you know, names that have gone and forgotten, some that stayed on like Merrill Lynch, and then local firms. I left the Board of Trade to join Continental Grain because they'd set a broker to deal with financial futures and would be oriented like that. And I had worked with Walter Goldschmidt, who was on the committee, but it was a market that was dominated by Stotler, Hennessy, Conti, Cargill, you know, the brokers, AC Israel. These were people and names that have long gone. But the initial liquidity was essentially ag brokers turned ag financial, local speculators who we sold seats to, Ginnie Mae permits. It was the creation of a new identity of membership. My mentor and friend, Les Rosenthal, led the battle, and if he hadn't been chair of the committee and put his reputation on the idea, I think none of it would have happened. He was a powerhouse, and at that time, the exchange was chaired by Fred Ullman. I don't know, Ullman Grain. And so, but it was friendly affairs, and the Board of Trade and the big users, Billy and Eddie O'Connor, were very active. So it was really a market, funny enough, made in Chicago, by Chicago companies, by Chicago risk takers. And for that reason, most of the people thought it would never succeed. When we started it, we envisioned a family of interest rates, and I think I was quoted in Forbes or Fortune or something like that, saying, look, there weren't at that point in the early 70s, there was no long-term bonds outstanding. And even when we launched the bonds, the total supply was 18 billion. We issued 54 billion in July of a single coupon. The total outstanding of all bonds in U.S. history was 18 billion. So even then, it was viewed as an anomaly, and the U.S. would never issue 30-year paper. But we effectively took the Ginny design, and bonds came in, and it was a perfect storm. The government issued the 7 5/8 of 07, then it issued the 7 7/8 of 07, which was nicknamed the James Bond. So we traded the James Bond, was the current outstanding coupon. They were there, always, there and inventing. So it was always a positive effect. You never want to be a monopolist per se, right? It's always good. And they were always there. But, they split. They went T-bill wise. We went long bonds. And there was never direct competition. The direct competition came from the American Stock Exchange that listed a Ginnie Mae contract, and then the New York Stock Exchange, which listed a bond contract. So everybody thought that these guys in Chicago, they came up with New York as the natural home. People used to say to me, "Oh, this is terrible. The tail is wagging the dog." And I used to say, no, hold on. The dog moved to Chicago.
John Lothian News would like to thank those individuals who have contributed to our Markets Wiki Education GoFundMe campaign. Their financial assistance allows us to produce and distribute videos like this for our Open Outcry Traders History Project or the Path to Electronic Trading video series. Join them in supporting John Lothian News, capturing the history of our industry.